Comparing Atlantic revolutions. Despite their common political vocabulary and broadly democratic character, the Atlantic revolutions differed substantially from one another. They were triggered by different circumstances, expressed quite different social and political tensions, and varied considerably in their outcomes. Liberty, noted Simón Bolívar, is a succulent morsel, but one difficult to digest. Digesting liberty occurred in quite distinct ways in the various sites of the Atlantic revolutions. The North American Revolution, 1775 to 1787. Every schoolchild in the United States learns early that the American Revolution was a struggle for independence from oppressive British rule. That struggle was launched with the Declaration of Independence in 1776, resulted in an unlikely military victory by 1781, and generated a federal constitution in 1787, joining 13 formerly separate colonies into a new nation. It was the first in a series of upheavals that rocked the Atlantic world and beyond in the century that followed. But was it a genuine revolution? What precisely did it change? By effecting a break with Britain, the American Revolution marked decisive political change, but in other ways, it was, strangely enough, a conservative movement, because it originated in an effort to preserve the existing liberties of the colonies, rather than to create new ones. For much of the 17th and 18th centuries, the British colonies in North America enjoyed a considerable degree of local autonomy, as the British government was embroiled in its own internal conflicts and various European wars. Furthermore, Britain's West Indian colonies seemed more profitable and of a greater significance than those of North America. In these circumstances, local elected assemblies in North America, dominated by the wealthier property-owning settlers, achieved something close to self-government. Colonists came to regard such autonomy as a birthright and part of their English heritage. Thus, until the mid-18th century, almost no one in the colonies thought of breaking away from England because participation in the British Empire provided many advantages: protection in war, access to British markets, and confirmation of the settlers' continuing identity as Englishmen, and few drawbacks. There were, however, real differences between Englishmen in England and those in the North American colonies. Within the colonies, English settlers had developed societies described by a leading historian as the most radical in the contemporary Western world. Certainly, class distinctions were real and visible, and a small class of wealthy gentlemen, the Adamses, Washingtons, Jeffersons, and Hancocks, wore powdered wigs, imitated the latest European styles, were prominent in political life, and were generally accorded deference by ordinary people. But the ready availability of land following the dispossession of Native Americans, the scarcity of people, and the absence of both a titled nobility and a single established church meant that social life was far more open than in Europe. No legal distinctions differentiated clergy, aristocracy, and commoners as they did in France. All free men enjoyed the same status before the law, a situation that excluded black slaves and, in some ways, white women as well. These conditions made for less poverty, more economic opportunity, fewer social differences, and easier relationships among the classes than in Europe. The famous economist Adam Smith observed that British colonists were republican in their manners and their government well before their independence from England. Thus, the American Revolution grew not from social tensions within the colonies, but from a rather sudden and unexpected effort by the British government to tighten its control over the colonies and to extract more revenue from them. As Britain's global struggle with France drained its treasury and ran up its national debt, British authorities, beginning in the 1760s, looked to America to make good these losses. Abandoning its neglectful oversight of the colonies, Britain began to act like a genuine imperial power, imposing a variety of new taxes and tariffs in the colonies without their consent, for they were not represented in the British Parliament. Many of the colonists were infuriated because such measures challenged their economic interests, their established traditions of local autonomy, and their identity as true Englishmen. Armed with the ideas of the Enlightenment, popular sovereignty, natural rights, the consent of the governed, they went to war, and by 1781 they had prevailed, with considerable aid from the French, who were only too pleased to harm the interests of their British rivals. What was revolutionary about the American experience was not so much the revolution itself, but the kind of society that had already emerged within the colonies. Independence from Britain was not accompanied by any wholesale social transformation. Rather, the revolution accelerated the established democratic tendencies of the colonial societies. Political authority remained largely in the hands of existing elites who had led the revolution, although property requirements for voting were lowered, and more white men of modest means, such as small farmers and urban artisans, were elected to state legislators. This widening of political participation gradually eroded the power of traditional gentlemen, but no women or people of color shared in these gains. Land was not seized from its owners, except in the case of pro-British loyalists who had fled the country. Although slavery was gradually abolished in the northern states, where it counted for little, it remained firmly entrenched in the southern states, where it counted for much. Chief Justice John Marshall later gave voice to this conservative understanding of the American Revolution. All contracts and rights respecting property remained unchanged by the Revolution. In the century that followed independence, the United States did become the world's most democratic country, but this development was less the direct product of the Revolution and more the gradual working out in a reformist fashion of earlier practices and the principles of equality announced in the Declaration of Independence. Nonetheless, many American patriots felt passionately that they were creating a new order for the ages. James Madison in the Federalist Papers made the point clearly. We pursued a new and more noble course, and accomplished a revolution that has no parallel in the annals of human society. Supporters abroad agreed. On the eve of the French Revolution, a Paris newspaper proclaimed that the United States was the hope and model of the human race. In both cases, they were referring primarily to the political ideas and practices of the new country. The American Revolution, after all, initiated the political dismantling of Europe's New World empires. The right to revolution, proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence and made effective only in a great struggle, inspired revolutionaries and nationalists from Simón Bolívar in 19th century Latin America to Ho Chi Minh in 20th century Vietnam. Moreover, the new U.S. Constitution, with its Bill of Rights, checks and balances, separation of church and state, and federalism, was one of the first sustained efforts to put the political ideas of the Enlightenment into practice. That document and the ideas that it embraced echoed repeatedly in the political upheavals of the century that followed. The French Revolution, 1789 to 1815. Act 2 in the drama of the Atlantic Revolutions took place in France, beginning in 1789, although it was closely connected to Act 1 in North America. Thousands of French soldiers had provided assistance to the American colonists and now returned home full of Republican enthusiasm. Thomas Jefferson, the U.S. ambassador in Paris, reported that France has been awakened by our revolution. More immediately, the French government, which had generously aided the Americans in an effort to undermine its British rivals, was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy and had long sought reforms that would modernize the tax system and make it more equitable. In a desperate effort to raise taxes against the opposition of the privileged classes, the French king Louis XVI had called into session an ancient representative body, the Estates General. It consisted of male representatives of the three estates or legal orders of pre-revolutionary France: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. The first two estates comprised of about 2% of the population, and the third estate included everyone else. When that body convened in 1789, representatives of the Third Estate soon organized themselves as the National Assembly, claiming the sole authority to make laws for the country. A few weeks later, they drew up the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which forthrightly declared that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. These actions, unprecedented and illegal in the Ancien Regime, the old regime, launched the French Revolution and radicalized many of the participants in the National Assembly. The French Revolution was quite different from its North American predecessor. Whereas the American Revolution expressed the tensions of a colonial relationship with a distant imperial power, the French insurrection was driven by sharp conflicts within French society. Members of the titled nobility, privileged, prestigious, and wealthy, represented and resisted the monarchy's efforts to subject them to new taxes. Educated middle-class men such as doctors, lawyers, lower-level officials, and merchants were growing in numbers and sometimes in wealth, and were offended by the remaining privileges of the aristocracy, from which they were excluded. Ordinary urban men and women, many of whose incomes had declined for a generation, were hit particularly hard in the late 1780s by the rapidly rising price of bread and widespread unemployment. Peasants in the countryside, though largely free of serfdom, were subject to hated dues imposed by their landlords, taxes from the state, obligations to the church, and the requirement to work without pay on public roads. As Enlightenment ideas penetrated French society, more and more people, mostly in the Third Estate, but also including some priests and nobles, found a language with which to articulate these grievances. The famous French writer Jean-Jacques Rousseau had told them that it was manifestly contrary to the law of nature that a handful of people should gorge themselves with superfluities while the hungry multitude goes in want of necessities. These social conflicts gave the French Revolution, especially during its first 5 years, a much more violent, far-reaching, and radical character than its American counterpart. It was a profound social upheaval, more comparable to the revolutions of Russia and China in the 20th century than to the earlier American Revolution. Initial efforts to establish a constitutional monarchy and promote harmony among the classes gave way to more radical measures, as internal resistance and foreign opposition produced a fear that the revolution might be overturned. In the process, urban crowds organized insurrections. Some peasants attacked the residences of their lords, burning the documents that recorded their dues and payments. The National Assembly decreed the end of all legal privileges and eliminated what remained of feudalism in France. Even slavery was abolished, albeit briefly. Church lands were sold to raise revenue, and priests were put under government authority. In 1793, King Louis XVI and his Queen Marie Antoinette were executed, an act of regicide that shocked traditionalists all across Europe and marked a new stage in revolutionary violence. What followed was the Terror of 1793 to 1794. Under the leadership of Maximilien Robespierre and his Committee of Public Safety, tens of thousands deemed enemies of the revolution lost their lives on the guillotine. Shortly thereafter, Robespierre himself was arrested and guillotined, accused of leading France into tyranny and dictatorship. The revolution, remarked one of its victims, was devouring its own children. Accompanying attacks on the old order were efforts to create a wholly new society, symbolized by a new calendar with the year 1 in 1792, marking a fresh start for France. Unlike the Americans who sought to restore or build on earlier freedoms, French revolutionaries perceived themselves to be starting from scratch and looked to the future. For the first time in its history, the country became a republic and briefly passed universal male suffrage, although it was never implemented. The old administrative system was rationalized into 83 territorial departments, each with a new name. As revolutionary France prepared for war against its threatened and threatening neighbors, it created the world's largest army, with some 800,000 men, and all adult males were required to serve. Led by officers from the middle and even lower classes, this was an army of citizens representing the nation. In terms of gender roles, the French Revolution did not create a new society, but it did raise the question of female political equality far more explicitly than the American Revolution had done. Partly this was because French women were active in the major events of the Revolution. In July 1789, they took part in the famous storming of the Bastille, a large fortress, prison, and armory that had come to symbolize the oppressive old regime. In October of that year, some 7,000 Parisian women, desperate about the shortage of bread, marched on the palace at Versailles, stormed through the royal apartments searching for the despised Queen Marie Antoinette, and forced the royal family to return with them to Paris. Backed by a few male supporters, women also made serious political demands. They signed petitions detailing their complaints: lack of education, male competition in female trades, the prevalence of prostitution, the rapidly rising price of bread and soap. One petition, reflecting the intersection of class and gender, referred to women as the third estate of the third estate. Another demanded the right to bear arms in defense of the revolution. Over 60 women's clubs were established throughout the country. A small group called the Cercle Social, the Social Circle, campaigned for women's rights, noting that the laws favor men at the expense of women, because everywhere power is in your hands. The French playwright and journalist Olympe de Gouges appropriated the language of the Declaration of Rights to insist that woman is born free and lives equal to man in her rights. But the assertion of French women in the early years of the Revolution seemed wildly inappropriate and threatening to most men, uniting conservatives and revolutionaries alike in defense of male privileges. And so, in late 1793, the country's all-male legislative body voted to ban all women's clubs. Women are ill suited for elevated thoughts and serious meditation, declared one of the male representatives. A woman should not leave her family to meddle in affairs of government. Here was a conception of gender that defined masculinity in terms of exercising political power. Women who aspired to do so were, in the words of one revolutionary orator, denatured viragos, domineering women. In short, not really women at all. Thus, French revolutionaries were distinctly unwilling to offer any political rights to women, even though they had eliminated class restrictions, at least in theory, granted religious freedom to Jews and Protestants, and abolished slavery. Nonetheless, according to a leading historian, the French Revolution, more than any other event of its time, opened the question of women's rights for consideration, and thus laid the foundations for modern feminism. If not in terms of gender, the immediate impact of the revolution was felt in many other ways. Streets got new names, monuments to the royal family were destroyed, titles vanished, people referred to one another as citizens so-and-so. Real politics in the public sphere emerged for the first time as many people joined political clubs, took part in marches and demonstrations, served on local committees, and ran for public office. Ordinary men and women, who had identified primarily with their local communities, now began to think of themselves as belonging to a nation. The state replaced the Catholic Church as the place for registering births, marriages, and deaths, and revolutionary festivals substituted for church holidays. More radical revolutionary leaders deliberately sought to convey a sense of new beginnings and endless possibilities. At a festival of unity held in 1793 to mark the first anniversary of the end of the monarchy, participants burned the crowns and scepters of the royal family in a huge bonfire, while releasing a cloud of 3,000 white doves. The Cathedral of Notre Dame was temporarily turned into the Temple of Reason, while the Hymn to Liberty combined traditional church music with the explicit message of the Enlightenment. O liberty, sacred liberty, goddess of an enlightened people, rule today within these walls. Through you this temple is purified. Liberty, before your reason chases out deception. Error flees, fanaticism is beaten down. Our gospel is nature, and our cult is virtue. To love one's country and one's brothers, to serve the sovereign people, these are the sacred tenets and pledge of a republican. Elsewhere too, the French Revolution evoked images of starting over. Witnessing that revolution in 1790, the young William Wordsworth, later a famous British romantic poet, imagined human nature seeming born again. Bliss it was in that dawn to be alive, he wrote, but to be young was very heaven. The French Revolution also differed from the American Revolution in the way its influence spread. At least until the United States became a world power at the end of the 19th century, what inspired others was primarily the example of its revolution and its constitution. French influence, by contrast, spread through conquest, largely under the leadership of Napoleon Bonaparte. A highly successful general who seized power in 1799, Napoleon is often credited with taming the revolution in the face of growing disenchantment with its more radical features and with the social conflicts it generated. He preserved many of its more moderate elements, such as civil equality, a secular law code, religious freedom, and promotion by merit, while reconciling with the Catholic Church and suppressing the revolution's more democratic elements in a military dictatorship. In short, Napoleon kept the revolution's emphasis on social equality for men, but dispensed with liberty. Like many of the revolution's ardent supporters, Napoleon was intent on spreading its benefits far and wide. In a series of brilliant military campaigns, his forces subdued most of Europe, thus creating the continent's largest empire since the days of the Romans. Within that empire, Napoleon imposed such revolutionary practices as ending feudalism, proclaiming equality of rights, insisting on religious toleration, codifying the laws, and rationalizing government administration. In many places, these reforms were welcomed, and seeds of further change were planted. But French domination was also resented and resisted, stimulating national consciousness throughout Europe. That too was a seed that bore fruit in the century that followed. More immediately, national resistance, particularly from Russia and Britain, brought down Napoleon and his amazing empire by 1815, and marked an end to the era of the French Revolution, though not to the potency of its ideas. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. Nor did the example of the French Revolution echo more loudly than in the French Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue, later renamed Haiti. Widely regarded as the richest colony in the world, Saint-Domingue boasted 8,000 plantations, which in the late 18th century produced some 40% of the world's sugar and perhaps half of its coffee. A slave labor force of about 500,000 people made up the vast majority of the colony's population. Whites numbered about 40,000, sharply divided between very well-to-do plantation owners, merchants and lawyers, and those known as petits blancs, or poor whites. A third social group consisted of some 30,000 gens de couleur libre, freed people of color, many of them of mixed race background. Saint-Domingue was a colonial society very different from the New England colonies or even the southern colonies of British North America. Given its enormous inequalities and its rampant exploitation, this Caribbean colony was primed for explosion. In such a volatile setting, the idea as an example of the French Revolution lit several fuses and set in motion a spiral of violence that engulfed the colony for more than a decade. The principles of the revolution, however, meant different things to different people. To the Grands Blancs, the rich white landowners, it suggested greater autonomy for the colony and fewer economic restrictions on trade, but they resented the demands of the Petits Blancs, who sought equality of citizenship for all whites. Both white groups were adamantly opposed to the insistence of free people of color that the rights of man meant equal treatment for all free people, regardless of race. To the slaves, the promise of the French Revolution was a personal freedom that challenged the entire slave labor system. In a massive revolt beginning in 1791, triggered by rumors that the French king had already declared an end to slavery, slaves burned 1,000 plantations and killed hundreds of whites as well as mixed-race people. Soon, warring factions of slaves, whites, and free people of color battled one another. Spanish and British forces, seeking to enlarge their own empires at the expense of the French, only added to the turmoil. Amid the confusion, brutality, and massacres of the 1790s, power gravitated toward the slaves, now led by the astute Toussaint Louverture, himself a former slave. He and his successor overcame internal resistance, outmaneuvered the foreign powers, and even defeated an attempt by Napoleon to re-establish French control. When the dust settled in the early years of the 19th century, it was clear that something remarkable and unprecedented had taken place, a revolution unique in the Atlantic world and in world history. Socially, the last had become first. In the only completely successful slave revolt in world history, the lowest order of the society, slaves, became equal, free, and independent citizens. Politically, they had thrown off French colonial rule, creating the second independent republic in the Americas and the first non-European state to emerge from Western colonialism. They renamed their country Haiti, a term meaning mountainous or rugged in the language of the original Taino people. It was a symbolic break with Europe and represented an effort to connect with the long-deceased native inhabitants of the land. Some, in fact, refer to themselves as Incas. At the formal declaration of Haiti's independence on January 1, 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the new country's first head of state, declared, "I have given the French cannibals blood for blood. I have avenged America." In defining all Haitian citizens as black and legally equal regardless of color or class, Haiti directly confronted elite preferences for lighter skin, even as it disallowed citizenship for most whites. Economically, the country's plantation system, oriented wholly toward the export of sugar and coffee, had been largely destroyed. As whites fled or were killed, both private and state lands were redistributed among former slaves and free blacks, and Haiti became a nation of small-scale farmers producing mostly for their own needs, with a much smaller export sector. The destructiveness of the Haitian Revolution, its bitter internal divisions of race and class, and continuing external opposition contributed much to Haiti's abiding poverty, as well as to its authoritarian and unstable politics. So too did the enormous independence debt that the French forced on the fledgling republics in 1825, a financial burden that endured for well over a century. Freedom in Haiti came to mean primarily the end of slavery, rather than the establishment of political rights for all. In the early 19th century, however, Haiti was a source of enormous hope and of great fear. Within weeks of the Haitian slave uprising in 1791, Jamaican slaves had composed songs in its honor, and it was not long before slave owners in the Caribbean and North America observed a new insolence in their slaves. Certainly, its example inspired other slave rebellions, gave a boost to the dawning abolitionist movement, and has been a source of pride for people of African descent ever since. To whites throughout the hemisphere, the cautionary saying, "Remember Haiti," reflected a sense of horror at what had occurred there, and a determination not to allow political change to reproduce that fearful outcome again. Particularly in Latin America, these events in Haiti injected a deep caution and social conservatism in the elites, who led their countries to independence in the early 19th century. Ironically, though, the Haitian Revolution also led to a temporary expansion of slavery elsewhere. Cuban plantations and their slave workers considerably increased their production of sugar as that of Haiti declined. Moreover, Napoleon's defeat in Haiti persuaded him to sell to the United States the French territories known as the Louisiana Purchase, from which a number of slave states were carved out. Nor did the example of Haiti lead to successful independence struggles in the rest of the 30 or so Caribbean colonies. Unlike mainland North and South America, Caribbean decolonization had to wait the 20th century. In such contradictory ways did the echoes of the Haitian Revolution reverberate in the Atlantic world. Spanish-American Revolutions, 1808 to 1825. The final act in a half-century of Atlantic revolutionary upheaval took place in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies of mainland Latin America. Their revolutions were shaped by preceding events in North America, France, and Haiti, as well as by their own distinctive societies and historical experiences. As in British North America, native-born elites, known as Creoles, in the Spanish colonies were offended and insulted by the Spanish monarchy's efforts during the 18th century to exercise greater power over its colonies and to subject them to heavier taxes and tariffs. Creole intellectuals had also become familiar with ideas of popular sovereignty, republican government, and personal liberty derived from the European Enlightenment. But these conditions, similar to those in North America, led initially only to scattered and uncoordinated protests rather than to outrage declarations of independence, war, and unity, as had occurred in the British colonies. Why did Spanish colonies win their independence almost 50 years later than those of British North America? Spanish colonies had long been governed in a rather more authoritarian fashion than their British counterparts, and were more sharply divided by class. In addition, whites throughout Latin America were vastly outnumbered by Native Americans, people of African ancestry, and those of mixed race. All of this inhibited the growth of a movement for independence, notwithstanding the example of North America and similar provocations. Despite their growing disenchantment with Spanish rule, Creole elites did not so much generate a revolution as have one thrust upon them by events in Europe. In 1808, Napoleon invaded Spain and Portugal, deposing the Spanish King Ferdinand VII and forcing the Portuguese royal family into exile in Brazil. With legitimate royal authority now in disarray, Latin Americans were forced to take action. The outcome, ultimately, was independence for the various states of Latin America, established almost everywhere by 1826. But the way in which independence occurred and the kind of societies it generated differed greatly from the experience of both North America and Haiti. The process lasted more than twice as long as it did in North America, partly because Latin American societies were so divided by class, race, and region. In North America, violence was directed almost entirely against the British and seldom spilled over into domestic disputes, except for some bloody skirmishes with loyalists. Even then, little lasting hostility occurred, and some loyalists were able to re-enter U.S. society after independence was achieved. In Mexico, by contrast, the move toward independence began in 1810 in a peasant insurrection, driven by hunger for land and by high food prices, and led successively by two priests, Miguel Hidalgo and José Morelos. Alarmed by the social radicalism of the Hidalgo-Morelos rebellion, Creole landowners, with the support of the church, raised an army and crushed the insurgency. Later, that alliance of clergy and Creole elites brought Mexico to a more socially controlled independence in 1821. Such violent conflict among Latin Americans, along lines of race, class, and ideology, accompanied the struggle against Spain in many places. The entire independence movement in Latin America took place under the shadow of a great fear, the dread of social rebellion from below, that had little counterpart in North America. The extensive violence of the French and Haitian revolutions was a lesson to Latin American elites that political change could easily get out of hand and was fraught with danger to themselves. In a border rebellion of Native Americans in Peru in the early 1780s, led by a man who claimed direct descent from the last Inca emperor, Tupac Amaru, reminded whites that they sat atop a potentially explosive society, most of whose members were exploited and oppressed people of color. So too did the Hidalgo Morelos rebellion in Mexico. And yet, the Creole sponsors of independence movements, both regional military leaders such as Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín, and their civilian counterparts, required the support of the people, or at least some of them, if they were to prevail against Spanish forces. The answer to this dilemma was found in nativism, which cast all of those born in the Americas, Creoles, Indians, mixed-race peoples, free blacks, as Americanos, while the enemy was defined as those born in Spain or Portugal. This was no easy task, because many Creole whites and mestizos saw themselves as Spanish and because great differences of race, culture, and wealth divided the Americanos. Nevertheless, nationalist leaders made efforts to mobilize people of color into the struggle with promises of freedom, the end of legal restrictions, and social advancement. Many of these leaders were genuine liberals who had been influenced by the ideals of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and Spanish liberalism. In the long run, however, few of those promises were kept. Certainly the lower classes, Native Americans, and slaves benefited little from independence. The imperial state was destroyed in Spanish America, concluded one historian, but colonial society was preserved. Nor did women as a group gain much from the independence struggle, though they had participated in it in various ways. Upper class or wealthy women gave and raised money for the cause and provided safe havens for revolutionary meetings. In Mexico, some women disguised themselves as men to join the struggle, while numerous working class and peasant women served as cooks and carriers of supplies in a women's brigade. A considerable number of women were severely punished for their disloyalty to the crown, with some 48 executed in Colombia. Yet, after independence, few social gains attended these efforts. General San Martín of Argentina accorded national recognition to a number of women, and modest improvement in educational opportunities for women appeared. But Latin American women continued to be wholly excluded from political life and remained under firm legal control of the men in their families. A further difference in the Latin American situation lay in the apparent impossibility of uniting the various Spanish colonies, so much larger than the small British territories of North America, despite several failed efforts to do so. Thus, no United States of Latin America emerged. Distances among the colonies and geographic obstacles to effective communication were certainly greater than in the eastern seaboard colonies of North America, and their longer colonial experience had given rise to distinct and deeply rooted regional identities. Shortly before his death in 1830, the great liberator Bolívar, who so admired George Washington and had so ardently hoped for greater unity, wrote in despair to a friend, "Latin America is ungovernable. Those who serve the revolution plow the sea." The aftermath of independence in Latin America marked a reversal in the early relationship of the two American continents. The United States, which began its history as the leftover dregs of the New World, grew increasingly wealthy, industrialized, democratic, internationally influential, and generally stable, with the major exception of the Civil War. The Spanish colonies, which took shape in the wealthiest areas and among the most sophisticated cultures of the Americas, were widely regarded as the more promising region compared to England's North American territories, which had a backwater reputation. But in the 19th century, as newly independent countries in both regions launched a new phase of their histories, those in Latin America became relatively underdeveloped, impoverished, undemocratic, politically unstable, and dependent on foreign technology and investment. Begun in broadly similar circumstances, the Latin American and North American revolutions occurred in very different societies and gave rise to very different historical trajectories.